band, as always, for playing. It was wonderful, and thank you for the songs you chose, Miriam and Holly. I have to say that because I only thanked Miriam at the first service, and Holly looked sad. So, so thank you. And welcome back, Carolini. After your South African tour, you're back on the European tour now, and it's lovely to have you back. Just a few weeks, yeah, cool. So, good morning, everybody else. It's lovely to see you. Welcome to everybody who's online as well. This morning, we're taking a break from the Ephesians study, and we're halfway through it. And it's a good time to take a break because, as you remember, we said that the book is in two pieces. Two distinct pieces, where the first part of the book of Ephesians is all about who we are in Christ. It's brilliant, it's wonderful. And the second part is all about then how we should live because of who we are in Christ. And normally when I'm planning these things, they're planned months and months in advance, the teaching schedule. I was put in a Sunday where we have a chance to do something else. Often it's for baptisms or for testimonies or for somebody to come and talk about something else entirely. And a while ago, about a month ago, I suppose, I said to myself, I wonder what we'll do that Sunday coming. And I had all sorts of plans, but I really felt the Spirit saying to me, there is written there, Testimony Sunday, you should share about your life. And I said, no thanks, I'll do something else. And I actually went and got out another sermon that I was going to talk about that had to do with Ephesians. And I read it, and I just had no peace about it at all. And I was talking to my wife then about a week or 2 weeks ago. And she said to me, you should really tell your story. And I said to her, I know, but I just really don't want to. And I thought, some of you here know me very well. You've known me for a very long time. And some of you hardly know me at all because we've only met in the last year or two from the church. And so, anyway, that's what's going to happen this morning. I'm going to tell you a bit about my story and about what God has done in my life. I'm not narcissistic enough to think that anybody's interested in listening to my life story. But you may be interested in hearing about what God has done and how God works in our lives. We're getting a bit of work done in the house. This guy came in last week and he said to me, how are you both? I said, how are you doing? He said to me, 3 questions. I said, okay. He said, first, what's a pastor? And I said, okay. And he said, secondly, how did you become a pastor? And thirdly, why did you become a pastor? So I said to him, I'm going to give you 3 quick answers. The first one is the word pastor comes from the Latin pastor, which means shepherd. And it generally signifies somebody who's a leader, a spiritual leader within a community. Secondly, how did I become a pastor? They gave me a job. And thirdly, why did I become a pastor? God called me. And it sounds so simple, doesn't it, when you put it like that? Not for the first time ever, he suggested that I didn't look much like a pastor. I don't know why people say that to me. You don't really look much like a pastor or a priest or whatever. And I don't know, I worked in financial services for a long time. And maybe I just got too old to change before I took on the job. I don't even know what a pastor's supposed to look like, just that I ain't it. But there you go. So I've divided this testimony into 4 sections. The first one is conversion, the second one courtship, the third one crisis, and the fourth one called. 4 C's, so that I could remember, and that maybe you'd remember some as well. So, start at the beginning. I was born in 1965. I know you're shocked. You probably think I'm a lot younger than that, and or a lot older, some of you. But I was born in 1965. I grew up on the north side of Dublin, where Beaumont Hospital is now, very near where Beaumont Hospital is. But in those days, it was just fields, and I would go cycling around there on my bicycle, which I loved to do at the time. I could do with doing a bit more bicycling now, but there you go. My mum was raised Catholic. My dad was raised Anglican, Church of Ireland. And at a time in their early 20s, both of them came to faith in Christ, a living faith in Jesus. And they started to attend an independent Christian evangelical church in the city centre. I was going to say a bit like this one, but actually it was very different. But maybe if it had been around still all these years later, it would be more like this one. And anyway, it was what it was. I have an older brother and a younger sister, and we grew up in a home that was full of love. My parents were really loving. They loved each other. They loved us, but it was also very strict. There was a lot of rules to follow, and this mainly stemmed from the teaching in the church that we attended, which was very strict. It was kind of pretty restrictive in terms of what you could and couldn't do. But the good stuff was that we learned as children that as Christian families, we were there to serve and to love other people. And a lot of people came into our family who needed help or companionship. My parents, they were great examples of what it is to live as a Christian. They were really kind people. And there was no Sunday went by without us having somebody else there for dinner, not obviously eating them, sharing the table. And you didn't get that one at all, did you? That went first. So, but they were there, and often we had people staying with us for short or longer periods of time. You weren't always entirely which bed you were going to get for the night, and they just really opened up their homes, and we had so many people there. Just an example is, I can remember when I was quite young, Christmas Day, my mum cooking Christmas dinner, and she took all these plates and heated them up, and she put tin foil, put a dinner on each one, put tin foil on them, stacked them up, and I was sitting in the car with about 6 or 7 plates on my knee, and Dad drove around, and he brought these plates of Christmas dinner into various houses, old people who couldn't really cook for themselves anymore. And that's the sort of thing that I was very used to doing. So they were great examples on how to live. I was a pretty average student in school. I went to school, but I was always in trouble. When I think about it now, I seem to be both in trouble inside school and outside school. I got whipped in school. There was a lot of corporal punishment in the place I went to. And I got chased by the Gardaí outside school. I got a reputation as being a difficult child. In fact, relatively recently, a woman came to the church here, and on the way out, she said to me, I'm glad you've turned out the way you have, because you were a horrible child. I was going to suggest to her she go on a different encouragement course, but I didn't say anything. It was many years later that I was diagnosed as having ADHD. Such a thing didn't exist in the 60s and 70s. You were just BOLD. And I was told that I was bold a great deal of the time. The first person to suggest to me as an adult that I might have ADHD was one of the first people I worked for, my boss. Because every time he went to the desk to find me, I was somewhere else. And I was just never there. So I was doing something else. It wasn't that I wasn't working, it just wasn't where I was supposed to be. And I remember him honestly sitting in his office and scratching his head and going, you wouldn't have a condition like, you know, that means you have to move around a lot. And I said, yeah, maybe. Anyway, they gave me a job out on the road soon afterwards. I was traveling all over the place, which suited me much better. About a year ago, I was taking a funeral here, and one of the people who knew me as a youth, a leader of camps that I'd attended, was here at the funeral. And afterwards, we were having a cup of coffee inside in the sports hall, and he said to me, you know, he said, it's amazing. I said, what's amazing? He said, looking at you, taking the funeral, considering the sort of teenager you were. And I said to him, and he's a lovely guy, and I really trust him, and I said, can you explain to me what I was like? Because I said, I've heard this before, and I thought I was normal. So I said, you know, how would you describe what I was like as a teenager? So he stood there a bit embarrassed, and he was searching for words, and after a few minutes he said, challenging. I said, well, what was challenging look like? He said, Dougie, you were like a whirlwind. He said, everywhere you went, and you were very disruptive at most things that were going on. He said, especially when it came to doing the dishes or something like that. If you were on a team to do the dishes, you were off having a smoke in the log cabin or something, you know. And I said, okay. So as I said earlier, there was a lot of rules when I was growing up. And instead of using those rules or guidelines to build a framework for my life in which to live, I saw them as a challenge. and I found ever more creative ways in which to ignore or break them. As my mother used to say to me, "You're a bit of a devil," and I was. Now, they tried very hard to get me to, be a different type of person. My Sundays, the day of rest, consisted of Boys' Brigade Bible class at 9 a.m., church at 11 a.m., Sunday school at 3 p.m., evening service at 7 p.m., and if I was really good, the 8:30 in the YMCA. I was sent to BEC camps, Scripture Union camps. I was in youth clubs, and I put my hand up to every single altar call because I was afraid I'd go to hell. But by the time I was in my late teens, I had decided that God did not exist. And I tried to educate my father in my newfound atheism. He wasn't buying it, by the way. And no matter how I tried to bring him around to my way of thinking, he wasn't up for it. He told me many years later that, well, not many years, a few years later, that he had despaired of me at that time, and that he fully expected to visit me in Mountjoy jail. And I hasten to add, I have never been incarcerated up to now. But my teen years were not a particularly happy time in my life, and more than once I considered ending my days. However, I never told anyone that I was so unhappy, and I couldn't really figure out the source of my pain. I just felt like an outsider all of the time. In my late teens, I continued to go to Christian events in Avoca Manor Christian Adventure Centre, not because I had even the slightest interest in God at that time, but because there was girls there. And I found that I had something of a talent for playing the piano, and I hadn't bothered playing it very often, to be honest with you, up till then. But they had a big wide stool and this old acoustic piano. And I found if I sat down on the stool and played music late at night, girls would come and sit on the stool beside me. And so I learned a whole repertoire of Simon and Garfunkel songs, and for the more depressed girls, Neil Young songs. And I would sing these of an evening, and they would come and sit beside me. And I had many, many girlfriends. But none of them lasted longer than a month. I was... maybe it was the ADHD, but they were all short term. But anyway, I left school and I got a job in an insurance company. Actually, when I left school, I got enough points to get into Trinity after doing the Leaving Cert twice. To get into Trinity to do, I wanted to do law, but didn't get any points to do that because I really hadn't done a lot in school, except plays and musicals and things like that, which I loved. And I remember on the CAO thing that came out. They had the CAO back in the 70s. And it came out, it said, I was offered a place in Trinity doing mental and moral science. And I had no idea what the course was about. And I remember sitting down with my dad in the kitchen, on the table, and he said to me, "So, what's this course, mental and moral science?" And I said, I don't know. I didn't really know what it was. He said, "What would you be at the end of it?" I said, a mental and moral scientist. And he said, I think you should get a job. And I said, "Dad, I think you're right." So I didn't go to college at that stage. I went and I got a job. And I worked in insurance companies for the next 28 years. When I was 20 years old, I went on a weekend away down to Avoca Manor, hoping to meet a girl. But instead, God had other plans, and I met him instead. And this guy was preaching from the north. I'd love to meet him again sometime, actually, just to tell him that I wasn't listening to him. No, not to tell him that, but to thank him for his efforts. He was preaching away, and I decided I wasn't going to listen to a word he said, and I didn't. And there was another guy sitting close to me who knew me, and he just passed me a note that said, "Now is the time." That's all it said. And it was extraordinary, this conviction of the Holy Spirit and this need to get right with God just filled me at that moment in time. And I literally ran out of the room. I just got up. They were all looking at me, just went out the door. And I found somewhere quiet where I could be with God. And right there and then, he accepted me back into his loving arms. And I promised to try and follow him for the rest of my days. I'd love to tell you that at that time I was filled with an incredible sense of peace and love and shalom, but I wasn't. I was actually filled with anxiety. And I had this gnawing fear, an uncomfortableness that lasted for decades. I remember being on a bus, actually, going through Dunleary. I've no idea why I was going through Dunleary, because I lived in Beaumont. But being on a bus in Dunleary, and maybe it was to get the Dart, and just this sense of absolute terror, really. But yet, even in those tough times, God was there with me, beside me. And there was many times I just felt the presence of God in incredible ways. Second part of the story, courtship. This is the romantic part of the story. Everybody loved this in the first service, but then they were older. At 21, I arrived back from a business trip to the Netherlands, and my best mate, Dave Adams, he asked me and a group of friends to come over for the bank holiday Monday. It was the 2nd of June, 1986, before many of you were born. And on the 2nd of June, 1986, I went over to his house, and we were supposed to walk the pier, a group of us, and come back and have chips. That's what we did for excitement back in the 80s, kids. And so we were doing that, and his sister was there. And I'd met her once before, and she told me that she was thoroughly unimpressed with me the first time she met me. I said to her afterwards, remember that first time you met me? She said, yeah, you're a bit full of yourself. I said, okay. But this time, she walked down the pier with me and talked. I persuaded her to come. She was studying for the Leaving Cert. She's only a teenager. And I said to her, come on, come on, you know you want to do the walk. Anyway, she came for the walk. And we just ignored everybody else and just walked together. And we walked all the way back, just talking to each other as well. And we spent the evening eating chips together. And I think I was smitten. And it was time to go home. And so Dave said, come on, get into the car, lads. I'll drive you down to the train to get the train north side. And those were the days when a Toyota Corolla held about 9 or 10 people. And you'd never any worry about seatbelts or anything like that. And we were all piled into the car. And I was at the door like this. And I remember he was reversing out the driveway. Liz was standing at the door waving goodbye to everybody. Just around the corner here. And I said, stop the car. And he said, okay. And I jumped out of the car. And I ran back to the door where she was standing. And I said, I never got to say goodbye to you. And I grabbed her and kissed her passionately on the lips. Now, I thought I was going to get a smack in the back of the head. But she kissed me back. And 4 years later, we were married. And after we got married, we had 3 children. Megan, who's sitting just down here, you know, the singer. The small woman with the big voice. The pocket rocket. And, yeah, sorry. I'm not exactly huge myself, love. And we've 2 boys, Jonathan and Alan. And one of them is in Canada, and the other one is in Thailand at the moment. And throughout the 90s, I continued to play a lot of music. Music was my passion. I was mad into music. I absolutely loved it. And not just to get girls. I mean, I had my girl then. And but I was playing in a band called the Crystal River Band, and we had a residency in the Bagot Inn, which was a good gig place at the time. And I played at all these events like Together for the Kingdom, March for Jesus. You know, if you're of that era, they're all coming back to you now. And I got to play in the Point Depot when Louis Palau was preaching there, and it was crazy. But I seemed to be all the time out playing music, and I loved it. And I thought at that time that we would become rock stars. And I'd be able to give up the insurance, and I'd be touring the world with the Crystal River Band as famous. Unfortunately, that never happened, and the insurance company was the one paying the bills, so I ended up there instead, staying there. In 1998, we had a bit of a mad few months, because on the 1st of April 1998, I changed job. Then our second son was born, our youngest child was born a couple of weeks later. We moved house a couple of weeks later after that, and then my father-in-law died very unexpectedly. And a month after that, I went on tour of Bosnia-Herzegovina just after the war with another band. And it was a kind of a crazy time. And during that time away in Bosnia, I knew what it was like to be a rock star for a night. It was brilliant. We arrived at this one venue way down in Serbska where they hadn't seen anybody from the outside world for years because of the war. And the whole town seemed to come out to see the gig, and there was thousands of people there. And we arrived down in the back of a white van, and we had no idea. And when we got out of the van, there was all these guys around us with security written on T-shirts. And there was literally thousands of people there screaming as we went into the place. And I was wearing this big kind of black hat, felt hat with feathers out of it and everything. And I was waving, and it was brilliant, you know. The next night, I thought the drummer had been shot dead. And I honestly believed it. In fact, he'd been hit with a tomato. But I knew what it was like in moments to be a rock star and to be a jaded rock star in 2 days. And somebody did actually fire a bullet over our heads when we were playing in Mostar, because we were damaging his business. He was the local pimp, and we were playing in a park where he did his business, and we were damaging his business. So he just took out an AK-47 and shot over our heads. And so that was kind of scary. But God was with us all the way through it. And even though it was scary, we knew that God was with us. And there was I haven't time to go into it, but there was a lot of hairy stuff happened on that tour. And then the next part of the story is crisis. That's the third part of the four. It was the millennium year of 2000. And it was a seminal year in my life. It didn't start well. My dad died 7 days into that year. 3 weeks after being diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. He was only 66, and I was racked with grief. I think it was compounded by the fact that my father-in-law, who I was very close to as well, had died just 18 months before. And I started to slide downhill pretty soon after that. And later that year, the company that I worked for asked me to do an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration degree. And they said, this will fast track you to senior management. And I realized at that moment in time, all the ambition that I had, and I was very ambitious, and I really wanted to, go to the top and make lots of money and all that sort of stuff. And it just seemed to drift away. And I wasn't sure that's just how I was feeling, or whether there was something else happening. But I turned down the offer of doing the MBA, and they were really pushing me, to kind of go up in the organization. And I just knew that it wasn't for me anymore, or at least the drive that I had seemed to be gone. Also at that time, I was involved here in DEC in everything from the worship team to home groups, pre-marriage courses. I was on every team and committee nearly that existed, apart from the finance team, because I was always terrible with figures. And it was like I had to use up every second of every single day. I also, in the middle of doing all that, I also became aware of how narrow my theology was, that I had a weakness, that I come from a very specific kind of church, and I knew little enough about wider theology. And something had stirred in me, so I started to study with the Open Theological College in the UK. Now, this is before the internet. And so they would send me over books, and I'd read them, I'd do essays, post them back, and they would post me back the results. It all took a long sort of time, but that suited me, because I was doing this at night, and the kids were small. And there was lots of joy as well, and particularly through learning. I realized that the God that I had thought was the God of rules and regulations wasn't, that he was the God of relationship. And I remember actually sitting in my study at home and laughing out loud as I read some of the books, and I read about what Paul was really saying about Jesus. And it was like I learned freedom through reading it. And I then later on progressed to do a master's degree in applied theology in the Irish Bible Institute. I was the slowest person ever to do it. I think it took me 9 years. I had a 5-year hiatus in the middle of it, which I'll tell you about in a second. But even though I found study very difficult, it is still my passion. I found my passion, and it's still my passion to try and understand the Bible and teach it in a way that is relevant for everyday life. And I just found who I was in doing that. However, in the spring of 2000, I suffered a serious psychotic episode. The late spring. Liz came home from church one Wednesday evening where she was down here at the girls' club to find me striding up and down the hall talking gibberish. I was completely incoherent. She got an awful fright, as you can imagine. It was very frightening for her. She finally got me asleep, and she cancelled my alarm clock, and she rang my boss to tell him that I wouldn't be in the next day. When I woke up the next morning, I was furious. I was so annoyed that she had done that. She left to go bring the kids to school and actually went off with a friend, and to my amazement, I went downstairs, and there was a friend of ours who was a psychologist sitting in the kitchen waiting for me. Talk about a setup. And she said, will we go for a walk? I said, yeah. And we walked around Bray Head for, I think, 4 or 5 hours before she begged me to sit down. And she was exhausted, really. And after just talking and talking for hours, I asked her probably the most stupid question I've ever asked anyone. I said to her, do you think I could do with some counselling? And she replied, yeah. So I over the next 2 years, I attended regular counselling sessions. And the grief that I was experiencing through the death of my dad and father-in-law, it was like something broke inside me, and it allowed all these other emotions to come to the fore. And it wasn't long before the reason for the gnawing anxiety that had been a part of my life for decades came to the surface. And that was because I had been sexually abused as a relatively young boy. And the shame and the anxiety that I felt because of it was a very destructive force in my life. I had buried the memories for years, and then at that time they came back in terrifying flashbacks. It was deeply unpleasant, and I still find it very difficult to talk about today. And during that time, Liz told me that I went missing for a year, and she said, you were there, but you weren't really there. And it was tough. But one of the positive things that came from that particular time was that the counsellor helped me to see how I was living my life. And she said to me, I've never really met anybody quite like you. She said, you're studying in college, you're on every committee in the church, you're doing all these courses, you're holding Bible studies, you have a full-time job, and you've got kids and a wife. And she said, you're the most driven person I've ever come across in my life. And I realized, she said, what are your priorities in life? I was kind of hemming and hawing around, you know. And she said, because you're not a really good husband or father, because you're never there. And I realized that what she said was true. And so I realized that God's priority for my life was that I was a husband and a father, and that they were more precious than any ministry I could be involved in. And so I resigned from everything in the church for 2 years, all ministry, and just was a dad and a father and a husband for those 2 years as I kind of reassessed everything I was doing. And if you're that person, if you remember nothing else from what I've said this morning, you're that person and you're doing all that stuff, ministry stuff, and you're not at home, I want to suggest to you need to reevaluate how you're living and what your priorities are. And the healing that I found in my life, I have to be honest, a lot of that came through being a husband and being a father. And understanding that that's God's way of how we should live. And that ministry should always take second place to those things. And I had to ask my wife for her forgiveness, which she gave me, and for being really a bit of a terrible husband, and for her being a ministry widow. And she forgave me, and we went on. And finally, after a time of rest and contemplation, I went back to playing music and leading small groups and preaching. But I was different. There was also a growing awareness of God calling me to something new and different. It didn't happen overnight, but over years. And this is the called part of the story. I've always been a bit suspicious of the prophetic amongst us, the people who say, "Thus saith the Lord," but seems to be only saying it to them and to nobody else. But there were 4 specific instances that I can remember when God spoke to me through prophetic people, whether they meant to be or not. The first person was an old lady. I've told you the story before. Anybody who's in the church, Mabel Watkins was her name. She was a lady who used to sit up the front of the church here. And when I was in my mid-20s, I remember coming in my suit one day from work. I don't know what was on. I sat beside her, and she gave me a belt of her stick on the leg, which she used to do. And she said to me, "One day you'll lead this church." I thought she was a nutty old woman. And I thought, of all the people on the face of the planet, I won't be the person leading the church. But I was afraid, of course, to say that to her because she was quite terrifying. And I just nodded and said nothing. Then afterwards, some years afterwards, 20 years afterwards, a friendly church nearby had a prophet over from the United States. And they asked whether they could bring this guy to come and meet our church leadership. And being the sort of person I am, I was highly skeptical of anybody. And this is a terrible thing to say, but the fact that he was an American prophet, I think made it even worse. And I think I just was going, come on, you know. But he was a lovely guy, and he came and he sat down, and he read a passage from Jeremiah, and he looked at me and he said, "That's for you." And I nearly fell off the seat, because I knew it was, but I didn't want it to be. And I decided I wouldn't tell anybody. I think I told Cliff. Cliff knew anyway at some stage, but I don't think I told anybody else. And later at that year, then at the business meeting, somebody read out the same thing, and there was the exact sentiment expressed. And I just decided, well, yeah, I just won't do anything about it. And then, I'm not sure if it was before or after these events, I can't remember dates, but this Canadian pastor, Henry Blackaby, who was famous for writing a book called Experiencing God, he came to speak here at DEC. And I'll never forget that Sunday as long as I live. He spoke up here. I didn't think he was a very good preacher, and he was quite a grumpy kind of his demeanor was grumpy, you know. And but I have never experienced anybody who I would say the Spirit of God came with them in a way that he did with that man. It was like he entered the room and I don't know, the atmosphere changed in the room. And he was an incredible man. He just died actually a few months ago. Anyway, he finished speaking, and he said, there was no altar call or anything. I remember exactly what he said. He said, "I suppose some of you have business to do with God." And he sat down. There was no music. I was playing the piano. I didn't play anything. I just sat there. And a phenomenon happened that I have never seen happen in the church since. And that was that people got up out of their seats, they came to the front, and they started to kneel down in the front of the church here. And I was amazed. It was like this out-of-body experience, because one second I was sitting there, and the next minute I was on my knees, and I couldn't really figure out how I'd gotten there. And as I was there, I heard a voice whisper in my ear, talk into my ear and say, "Feed my sheep." And I looked around to see who'd said that, and there was nobody there. So I remember I got up. He was sitting just in that seat there in the front, right there. And I got up and I sat down beside him. I said, "Mr. Blackaby, I think God just spoke to me." And all he said to me was, "You better do what he says, kid." And that was it. I had no idea what to do next. It seemed like there was this big wall of problems in front of me. First of all, there was no job opportunity for pastors that I knew about. I needed money, and I had kids, a mortgage, all that sort of stuff. And thirdly, my wife didn't want to be a pastor's wife. She talked to me a few times. It was really kind of funny. She told me the story about a friend of hers whose husband wanted to be a pastor. She didn't think he'd be a great pastor. And so she kept telling me the same story. And I said to her, I got the message. I said to her, I'm really clear about this. If God doesn't call you, he hasn't called me. I said, and I promise you, no sales patter. I'm not going to do anything to try and persuade you around this. And I said nothing. And that was it. And it was this sense of relief I got. I said, there you are, Lord. This is not going to happen, and these are all the reasons why. Thanks very much. We'll just leave it there. And I was kind of, that was it. I said, if you want me, you'll have to just make this happen. And as the next decade dawned, God worked and used circumstances around me to make things happen, depending on your theology of how God works. But the first thing that happened was the company I worked for were going to cut half the workforce. And I said, I might look into getting redundancy. I went to them and I said, I'd like to look at the redundancy program. They said to me, no, not you. You won't be made redundant. And I said, well, can I have redundancy? They said, no. I said, okay. Very soon after that, I was going to a rugby match with my brother-in-law, Dave, and we were on the way in, and I began to walk very slowly and to perspire. And he said to me, you all right? And I said, yeah, just grand, yeah. Yeah. And he said, will you promise me something? Will you promise you go to the doctor on Monday? I said, no problem, I'll go to the doctor on Monday. Went to the doctor on Monday, and she sat holding my hand, something that she never did. She wasn't that sort of a doctor. I was sitting there, and she just holding my hand like this, and I said to her, Michelle, why are you holding my hand? She said, shut up for a minute. I said, why? And she said, I'm thinking. And I said, what are you thinking? I'm thinking whether I should get an ambulance for you. And I said, why? And she said, because you're about to have a heart attack. I said, that's not good. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I went to Blackrock Clinic that afternoon, and 3 days later, I had open heart surgery and triple bypass at 46. And that was quite a change to my life, you can imagine. And then, as I was recovering from that, I remember this guy came to my door who's an atheist, and he'd be an evangelical atheist, if you know what I mean. He liked sharing the bad news. And but he knew me well, worked with me, and he came to the door, kids doing sport together, and he said to me something that really struck me. I opened the door, and he says to me, are you still in that place? And I said, yeah. He said, well, why don't you just go and do what your God has told you to do? I looked at him, I said, you don't believe in God. He said, that's not the point. I said, and then in June of that year, I was out walking in the park with Liz, and she just came up, took my hand, I'll never forget it. One afternoon, she just said, now's the time. I was overcome. I didn't know what to do. Went back into the office and said, I remember going in and talked to this guy, the directors, and I said to him, I'm applying for the redundancy. And he said, it's not in our plan that you go. I said, maybe not, but it's in God's plan. And he went kind of pale. And they did let me out and give me a few quid to go. And at that moment in time, it all kind of began to happen very quickly then. And, I went through the process you go through, getting redundancy and setting it all up. And the director guy said to me, I don't know what night of the week it was, probably a Friday, and he said to me, you have until 5 o'clock tonight to let me know if you want to stay. I would signed all the papers and everything, but he said, if we want you. So if you want to stay, you have till 5 o'clock tonight. At 5:15, I was sitting in my car in Sandymount, and I had what you could only describe as a major wobble, because I was leaving behind me all the security of, good job, pension, the whole lot, and I was suddenly terrified. And I decided I didn't know what to do. And I said, Lord, if there's anything you can do to help me to decide, would you just do it? Would you just send me a sign? And I don't suggest you do this, by the way. It's not the right thing to do all the time. But it's like I really felt afterwards that maybe God should have said to me, listen, how many signs do you want? I've sent people to your door, you've spoken to you, what do you want, like? And anyway, I was sitting in the car, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how God could tell me anyway in 10 minutes. It was a fairly short time frame before 5 o'clock. So I decided anyway I'd just go and park the car somewhere else. And I turned on the engine to go, and these are the words of the song that came on the radio. Rise up, shepherd, rise up, your flock has roamed far from the hills. Find your flock and get them to higher ground. And I went, oh, dear me. Well, if God can use a donkey to speak to a prophet, he can use Bruce Springsteen to talk to me. I'll be 11 years the pastor here on the 1st of July. And like every leader It's been rocky at times. There's been highs and lows. I can't really call it a job. It's a calling. But it's the best one in the world. Love it. You've got to know that it's a job also that you're guaranteed to fail in. It's like being a politician. Because it's simply impossible to match the different expectations that people have of you. None of us are good at everything. And it's the reason why the church is made up of people with all sorts of different gifts. And it's working together that actually makes the church work. I was at a conference recently, and one of the preachers was a pastor who had been about to give it all up and go do something else. And he used a phrase that jolted me as I heard it. Did you ever hear somebody say something, and you just go, that is me? And this is the phrase he used. He said of himself, I loved the restaurant, but couldn't handle the kitchen. And I said, that is me. I love the restaurant, but too much. I love the restaurant, but I really struggle in the kitchen. But over the past 11 years, I've come to trust Jesus more and more as I realize my own inability to shape the world and to keep cool in the kitchen. God calls all of us, not all to be pastors, but he does call all of us to serve him. Not because we're brilliant or because we have all the tools to finish every job. In fact, it's in our weakness that God can shine the most. Paul wrote to the church in Corinth about his own weak state, and that's when he asked God to take away his weakness. And the Lord replied to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. If I'm being honest, unlike Paul, I don't delight in insults or in hardship or persecution or difficulties. But I do recognize that when I am weak, that I am strong, because that's where God works the most. Amen.